From the Agency of Development of Democracy and Democratic Freedoms, the editor of Matrix of Freedom magazine. Online with us is Arne Koitmae, the head of the Central Election Committee of Republic of Estonia. Dovile Šakalienė, unfortunately, hasn't joined us today. Anastasia Sergeeva, the Russian dissident. Anicee from Engeland, from the Cranfield University, that's the UK. Domanska, chief researcher of the Center of Eastern Studies from Poland, and the ex-head of political department of the Embassy of Poland to Russia, Nikolaus von Twickel from Germany, the editor of the team on Russia, and Miss Natalie Melnyczuk, senior fellow, Michigan State University, former head of NATO Information and Documentation Center. So these are the guests online and offline. And I suggest that we start with a brief video, 5 minutes long. We have one speaker who was not able to attend us online, but this is her video introduction. Miss Dovile supports Ukraine a lot. She is the member of the Lithuanian Parliament's Defense and National Security Committee, the Minister of the Shadow Cabinet of Ministers.
Good morning, or rather good afternoon, dear colleagues. Apologies that I'm sending this video instead of participating live, but unfortunately my schedule does not allow today participation in the discussion. So I just wanted to share a couple of comments regarding the so-called elections of the Russian president. I think that we can all agree that these are so-called elections or fake elections because they do not correspond to any of the international standards.
Міжнародним стандартам, які зазвичай використовуються для забезпечення процесу прозрачних та неупереджених виборів. Але хотілося все ж таки розбити це питання на політичні та правові аспекти. Правові аспекти
be considered legitimate, not only because the rules are not applied to Russian territory, but also because they are organized in the occupied territories. So not only Russia has invaded Ukraine, occupied part of Ukraine's territory is forcing people in occupied territories to fight against their citizens using death threats or hostages, making hostages out of their family members, but also currently conducting genocide because kidnapping in large numbers, in dozens of thousands, Ukrainian children, and trying to erase their identity is one form of genocide. But at the same time, in these occupied territories, the occupying force is organizing so-called elections where they are suggesting that occupied people, that oppressed people of Ukraine, which are now in the occupied territories, must choose basically one candidate, a Russian president. They do not live in Russia. They live in Ukraine, in the occupied territories of Ukraine, currently occupied territories by Russia. So therefore, no elections organized by Russia are valid and legitimate there. But when we talk about political aspect of these so-called elections of Russian president, this is much more complicated issue, because I do not think anyone is as naive to believe that Russian society would choose anyone else but Putin if they could. I'm quite sure that even if every Russian citizen would be guaranteed, would have solid guarantees that nobody would persecute them, nobody would punish them, if they would vote for anyone that they would prefer, that they would choose anyone but Mr. Putin. I agree that numbers might be different, not, 87 or 95% for Mr. Putin. But regretfully, I don't doubt that absolute majority of Russian society would still choose their Tsar. This is a society that for hundreds of years, for centuries, have been supporting the imperial aggression politics, attacking their neighbors, occupying countries, trying to annihilate nations. I come from Lithuania. We have not forgotten 2 occupations by Russia in the last centuries. I come from a family that was persecuted and suffered attempts to exterminate by Russian occupant. So therefore, I do not believe that this war, this invasion into Ukraine, is just Putin's war. Just like the threats to invade NATO's territory are supported only by Putin and his closest allies. So let's not be naive. Russia is supporting its Tsar, whoever it is. They have organized at least 7 wars, 7 invasions only in the last 3 decades, not talking about the centuries that I mentioned before. So therefore, even though these elections legally are not valid, politically, the result would probably be not different by much. So our only hope is to ensure that Ukraine wins this war of aggression by Russia, that Ukraine settles victory in the battlefield. Otherwise, all our international concern, all our international condemnation of Mr. Putin, of these so-called elections, would be just a very small contribution into isolation, international isolation of Russia, and this is not enough. So I wish you a fruitful discussion, and I hope that next year we could have a bit different situation in the positive sense. So, Slava Ukraini!
Героям слава, дякую пані Довіле за все те, що вона робить для України і за те.
I thank you, Dovile, for everything that you do for Ukraine, for all the support. So the Russian authorities are conducting pseudo-elections not only in Russia but in the occupied territories, despite all the international law principles and norms, which immediately transfers this into the category of pseudo-elections. But of course, following up all that are war crimes. And the first thing that comes to your mind is that everything that happens in the occupied territories is an affront towards civilized West, which is not ready to agree with the legitimacy of the results of the Russian elections, but the people, residents of the occupied territories, are in the dab smack in the middle of this farcical event, and they do need certain support and what they should be doing. So Ms. Irina Bondarchuk prepared the presentation for you, how this affront to democracy is happening and what the Ukrainians should do under occupation, and Ms. Katerina Rashevska. Please provide us legal opinion and suggest concrete steps for Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. Colleagues, hello. Here today I represent the Center of Combating Disinformation from the time when the campaigning started, creating legal grounds for those pseudo-elections. From the beginning of the campaign, we have documented how they humiliated people, how they joked over the world democracy, calling what's happening at the territorial occupied territories as something that should be called democracy. So let me share some cases how Kremlin narratives are being disseminated at those territories, disseminating this mythical story of allegedly unbiased selection of the future president by the residents of the occupied territory. So the first thing that's happened from March the 17th until, February 17th until March the 7th, the members of the polling stations conducted door-to-door visits, claiming that they're informing the voters, informing about the elections themselves, also telling people that, well, we hope you understand whom you should be voting for, you should understand who brings peace to this land, that claiming that there's chaos and Nazi regime in Kyiv, while Putler will make them safe and it will ensure safety and security of the region. Well, those visits, those interviews was a heavy-handed example of trying to suggest to people who they should be voting for, because we all clearly understand in Moscow, St. Petersburg and other cities where there is even a droplet of opposition or resistance, people would not vote for Putler. They will be ruining the ballots, or like Yulia Navalny suggested at noon, silent demonstrations in front of the polling stations. But at the territories where there is no oversight or democratic control, well, of course, it's much easier to collect voices and tick the boxes for deceased and unborn, as they say. So what would be your legal assessment of this? Well, I believe it would make sense to listen till the end, because all those separate episodes make sense in being accumulated. So that's what I would do with the recommendations, what could be done. The Center of Combating or Countering Disinformation have identified that Russia launched the news campaign involving foreign journalists. Foreign journalists for Russia, that's how they named the project. And Putler all around the world found people who one way or another are in favor of Kremlin and Putler. What do I mean by this? So a person could be born in St. Petersburg, lived there all the life, but spent 4 years in French college. So then this person is brought and presented as if this is a French politician who represents the people of France and who says that allegedly everyone in France supports Putler. It's being broadcast exclusively for the domestic audience, for the consumption of the Russian sheeple, so that they will feel that the whole world votes for Putler and supports him. So now let's go through each speaker one by one. Speed up, okay. Miriam Mahmoud, Dutch blogger, visited temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and she is the daughter of Sonia van der Velde, who also supports Putler in pro-Kremlin position and tells that Putler is the savior for the whole world. The next one, Olesya Miloradovich, French politician expert, the one I mentioned already, born in St. Petersburg. She started in France for 4 years and now, for some reason, claims that she is a French political expert, a French citizen, claiming that the war in Ukraine should be concluded in favor of Kremlin, accepting Kremlin terms and conditions. Aukur Hauksson, the journalist from Iceland, he was sharing fakes about biolabs and Nazis, and that the events in Bucha, that's the theater of dead people, that it was all a show. Mehnur Singh, claims that as an Indian journalist he visited temporarily occupied territories to search for the truth, as he claims, because he believes that all the news generated from Ukraine is propaganda. Vincenzo Larusso. He is an avid fan of Putler, has T-shirts with his picture, and he tells stories about rebuilding the cities without actually stating that they were ruined by the Russian forces in the first place. Carlos Fernando Mamani Aligara, Irish journalist, published a number of articles about genocide against Lugansk residents. Laurent Braillard, French journalist, again, Nazi. Ukraine is a Nazi state, and the narrative is about the peace talks. Thierry Saint-Germain, he was the international observer during the previous events, claiming that this is the fight against, well, we recognize that they all support the narratives that they claim and allege to, but what do the simple people need to do? Can we move to that slide? This is what was happening in Zaporizhzhia. People, soldiers with machine guns came there. They would put the signatures for the sake of all people. Like I said, that's what they're going to be doing on the day of elections. Letting the deceased people vote, as they say. These are pictures of kids in the kindergarten about how to make the correct choice. I choose the president. And the main pieces of advice. Well, first of all, Ukraine and the whole world will never accept the re-election of Putin, of course. Do not attend the elections. Nobody forces you to tick the box for Putin. You can destroy the ballot. You can stay home if you are forced. Well, do come, but do nothing or destroy the ballot. Don't attend or organize any meetings or events, because we have the clear distinction between hostages and collaborators, and forced passportization. When the Russians are forcing passports on you, that doesn't mean that you automatically become the citizens of Russia. Without your application to change the citizenship, and probably Ms. Katerina will give in the legal position, you cannot change the citizenship. So all those passports are fakes. They have void, null legal force. So this is just a piece of paper. You are not the Russian after they forced it on you. Okay, there are recommendations from the foreign ministry, namely that you should not be joining gatherings of people, because Russians will be involved in some provocations, so stay away from mass gatherings. So, Ms. Katerina, yeah, thank you. Both the first speaker and Ms. Alina have already brought us into the context, and I will provide some legal opinion on what we heard. So, like the first speaker said, the situation looks straightforward from the legal standpoint, but it's absurd, because the whole civilized world recognizes that these are illegal elections, that conducting elections at the occupied territories go against the fundamental rights and human rights principles. And again, the Russian Federation was violating those principles for decades. Sovereignty, respect of human beings, etc. But there is another huge problem. How could we enforce all that? So some fundamental principles are being violated. What should we do? Ukraine is interested in reacting to this in the most efficient and expedient manner, not just making some empty statements like, we will not recognize the elections. Well, is it we will not recognize Putin as a legitimate president, or we will not recognize that the elections conducted at the illegal occupied territories make those elections at those territories illegal, but the but Putler is the legitimately elected president. And finally, there is Article 85 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. Represents the people of Russian Federation. So what about the head of the government or the ambassadors? So that means that all the ambassadors appointed by Putler should not bring their bona fide credentials and approve the agreements and all that, or representation of Russian Federation interests in the United Nations. Again, that means that the whole delegation of Russia should be taken out of that building. So speaking as a lawyer, I don't want to get into any political, civilizational, or ethical considerations, because we all acknowledge that this whole election is a farcical event. So the event that violates fundamental principles and fundamental principle status quo antebellum of the international humanitarian law. Occupation is a temporary event. Everybody recognizes that, but in the Russian Federation, nobody wants to acknowledge that. Also, it violates Article 45 of Haga Agreement, because people at the occupied territories are Ukrainian citizens who are forced to take allegiance by voting at the elections either to Putler or to the Russian Federation, being the state that occupied them. So all this is a violation of human rights, and if we look at the scale and contextual element, then those violations are large-scale and systematic. Violation of Article 25 of International Pact on Political and Civil Rights, guaranteeing the right to get involved in statehood affairs. And there is a general comment to this article by the expert from the Special Committee on Human Rights, who explained that the organizing elections under coercion and forcing people to vote is the violation of Article 25, and sooner or later will bring to invalidation of the elections. The history, unfortunately, doesn't have that many examples when the president who was elected at such pseudo-elections were disqualified. And you know all those cases. The presidents, so-called presidents of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who is not being acknowledged as such. But will they not acknowledge Putler? Let's be realistic. Who would support us? Like global south countries, where would they be? Or all those so-called international observers whom I showed you, whose profiles I showed, but who are not actually. We know how proper elections happen in democracies, how the European OSCE sends their observers, and the Russian Federation is still the member of this organization, but for some reason nobody from OSCE will go to the occupied territories. On top of that, lack of political pluralism, lack of freedom of media, lack of opposition in the Russian Federation, with forcing civil servants to vote. And it's not even about the voting. Everybody knows that Putler will generate huge percentage of trust from his people. Well, of course, that's a sarcastical, inadverted commas statement, but again, like in the case of Lukashenko, will we acknowledge those elections to be illegitimate, like with Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, when those elections were qualified as illegitimate? But I still believe that expecting that we could continue living under the illusion that after March the 17th there would be some positive results for us? No. It's all about whether Ukraine will be committed after those so-called elections in the occupied territories, that we present our clear position, because when in 2017 the elections happened at the occupied peninsula, Crimean Peninsula, well, UN conducted some special meeting, and, well, what should we do? What Ukraine should do in this case? Well, Ukraine should be soliciting support of Global South states, pass the resolution at the General Assembly of the United Nations, the new resolution, clearly stating the provisions that acknowledge the elections to be illegitimate. And everybody involved should be under sanctions. Everybody who was organizing elections at the occupied territories should be actors of criminal cases and included on the sanction list. We need to raise the issue of the legitimacy of the representatives of Putin at the international arena, and Putin himself should stay at the territory of the Russian Federation. After his arrest orders, he is not traveling that much, but now he would stay there as if he's imprisoned until the end of his yet another presidential term. Thank you, Katerina. From the standpoint of military hostilities, it doesn't matter whether the elections would happen there at the occupied territories or not. Snegurivka, you remember what happened in this village when, in Kharkiv region, when, or Kherson region, when they tried, but then the Russian troops retreated, and what they left in their wake is the humanitarian crisis. And it didn't matter that there was election conducted because it was all illegitimate. Yesterday, IFRS stated, this is IFRS, International Foundation of Election Systems, that of course goes against those elections in the occupied territories. And today, Arne Koitmae is with us, the head of the Central Election Committee of Estonia. Arne, can you share with us your position and focus probably on such issues as legitimacy or non-legitimacy of elections? What are the criteria of those of legitimacy or non-legitimacy status, and what would be the main lesson learned for the European community from those elections? Thank you.
Thank you. Dear friends, dear colleagues, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to discuss the upcoming so-called elections in the occupied Ukrainian territories. Just yesterday, the Foreign Affairs Committees of 20 parliaments, Estonia included, signed a joint statement emphasizing that the forthcoming presidential elections in Russia will neither be free or fair, and that they consider conducting elections in Ukraine's occupied territories as... Sorry, can you hear me? I just see.
Yes.
Okay. And that they consider conducting elections in Ukraine's occupied territories as entirely illegitimate and something that would not be recognized by the international community. And I agree with this statement 100%. Forcing the citizens of occupied territories to vote at Russian presidential elections does not have any legitimate cause, and it does not add any legitimacy to the results of the elections either. In general, conducting free and fair elections is not always simple, but the basic rules, they are straightforward. The principles of universal, equal, free, and secret suffrage must be followed at all times. And additionally, there are certain fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association, that must also be respected. And finally, elections must be organized by an impartial body, and also meaningful elections observation should be possible, both local and international. And none of these conditions are met for the upcoming election. It is very clear that freedom of vote is not possible at these elections at all. In a situation when the opposition cannot nominate their candidates, there is no freedom of media or speech or association when the civil liberties are not respected, and even the participation of the residents is closely monitored, and when there are negative consequences for those who refuse to vote. And myself, as a citizen of a country that was formerly occupied by the Soviet Union, I have some personal experience in this regard as well, since when I was a kid, I was deeply confused why the elections to the Supreme Soviet had no choice, no competition. They had mandatory participation. The results and voter participation data were clearly fake, and even not casting the vote was heavily discouraged. And when the results and even the participation rates of the elections are predetermined and no political debate is allowed, there can be no elections at all. Basically, all that remains is a ritual that the voters are forced to follow. But there is no intention of finding out the voters' will or who they support. The only goal is to artificially boost the claim to these occupied territories. And thus we must reject the idea of any legitimacy of these elections conducted by the Russian occupying power in the occupied Ukrainian territories. And I'm certain that these territories will be free too, and the rule of law will be restored. And only then can we have actual, meaningful, legitimate elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arne. Thank you that you find time to join this conversation. What is the main lesson for the European community from this election? How you feel?
And then esteemed journalists by raise of hands.
So I think it's important for the important takeaway or lesson here is not to recognize such elections invalid. I mean, this is not limited to Russia even, but some other countries as well. And I hope that there will be a general understanding of how these elections are run and what the consequences will be.
Дякую сердечно. Дякую, що були з нами на зв'язку. І я б хотіла...
Thanks a lot for being with us and for your thoughts. When conducting pseudo-elections, there are so many violations of the UN statutory documents and other international laws and codes and regulations. Does it mean that Ukraine should sue to international courts of law? To which particular court? What would be the jurisdiction? And what should the Ukrainian law enforcement officers focus on when they collect evidence to support and substantiate the facts of all those crimes being committed? Ms. Nadia? Yeah, hello everyone. Truth be told, there are a couple of options here in terms of jurisdiction and whether we can involve international jurisdiction and how we exhaust domestic courts of law. Well, Ms. Alina Bondarchuk has already stated that the allies of Putin's regime are disseminating propaganda and lies and fakes. Also, there are certain calls for genocide that we hear from those pseudo-journalists. Well, we have the Human Rights UN Committee, and so when we speak about the propaganda, that is the violation of the Pact on Political and Civic Rights. The calls for genocide would fall under the jurisdiction of ICC, International Criminal Code, and we can refer the case to the domestic courts of law from the countries where those people are citizens from. Well, you mentioned what? The Netherlands, France, right? Well, and just consider criminal liability domestically. And finally, when they force people to take passports of other country, well, the key word here is forcing, and which violates Geneva Convention, as was mentioned before, and also these people could not be forced or heavy-handedly enforced into voting. Again, violation of international humanitarian laws. Another challenge that we're facing is the fact that the only case when Ukraine can apply to the UN's International Court would be the case when Ukraine and the country, aggressor country, both ratified the relative UN conventions. Well, remember the recent case on prevention of funding of terrorism and discrimination in Crimea. So, what could be done in terms of collecting proper evidence? Well, we're facing tremendous challenges in this regard, truth be told, because we're talking here not only about documenting and processing facts of illegitimate elections. No, we, on top of that, need to document war crimes and the crimes against humanity that are also being perpetrated at the occupied territories as we speak. And there's a certain case of law that we started generating pre-invasion after Crimea was annexed and Russia entered Donetsk and Lugansk regions, and our courts of law had no access and our police to those regions, but still they started documenting the facts of crimes. But now the number of those crimes committed by the aggressor increased by the number of magnitude, and in this regard I would point your attention that should be the focus of high-quality evidence documentation. But in order to ensure this high quality, we need to introduce changes to our criminal procedural code. What those changes might be. On the open source information or SINT, something that potentially might become one of the main sources of evidence. It's just that according to our criminal procedural code, CPC, the procedure of documenting SINT data in order for it to be qualified as evidence in the court of law, it's outdated. Namely, the requirement to verify such information. So, speaking of the verification, there are a couple of options how it could be done, and one of them is obviously collect such information and confirm it from eyewitnesses and victims themselves. And here's another challenge that we're facing, because when we recognize that these people or their relatives are currently staying at the occupied territories, by default, it means that they are in the state of heightened risk. What does risk or threat might be? That they will be repressed. So how could we then protect such victims or witnesses? Currently, there are no framework arrangements how to protect those people. Again, something that we need to introduce as changes and amendments to our current legislation. Now, back to the topic on collecting evidence or intelligence. The challenge that we might be facing, how the collected evidence could be legitimately qualified as evidence attached to a particular case. not even evidence, but intelligence gathered by investigators, and usually it's confidential. But in order to show who is the source of this information, it's like reveal your informant. And this CPC, the Criminal Procedural Code, doesn't provide for any alternatives to go around this. And another area that is worth paying attention to is the fact that this crime of forcing people to vote could be qualified as the crime against humanity, the crime of persecution. Unfortunately, our criminal code does not have this particular crime, but you can find it in the Rome Statutes, and when Ukraine ratifies the Rome Statutes, then things would be so much easier. But for the time being, we can only collect evidence, and only when our legislation is being updated, we can then, and only then, file all this evidence to the ICC, asking to initiate the criminal proceedings against the crimes against humanity. Well, together with the organizers, we created fake election at proton.me. So this is the email address where people at the occupied territories can share the evidence that they collected, but they would not be taking photo pictures of armed people visiting them at home or ballots. So what should they send to us, which you would then qualify as evidence? Probably not as evidence now, but when we synchronize our legislation. Well, what we advise to our clients who are victims of those crimes is that they should, to the maximum detailed level possible, document everything, preferably in writing, and that use protected channels to share this information. But if there's secured channels, but if it's difficult to find such channels, well, your personal safety should be of paramount importance to you, of course. So probably we need to offer some webinars or seminars, code them somehow, and invite people from cyber security, or how can you protect your electronic communications. Such workshops would be quite valuable. Well, thank you for your practical recommendations. The topic of this roundtable discussion is the fact that through conducting these pseudo-elections, Russia makes a joke of democracy and elections. So what's the position of US as the leader of democratic world, and what could Ukraine do? What agenda should Ukraine promote after the pseudo-elections are conducted? I would like to ask a very experienced expert from the NATO Institute, the former Security Policy Department in NATO headquarters, and now senior researcher from Michigan University, Ms. Natalie Melnyczuk. The floor is yours.
Чи ви можете добре мене чути?
Чути вас прекрасно.
Дякую. Я зараз перейду на англійську мову, бо я би не хотіла зробити якусь помилку.
I will switch to English, and I don't want to make any
Thank you for having me here today. From the United States, I think one of the most important things to understand when trying to interpret how we act and react regarding Russia's war on Ukraine is that we have a very different political geography, history, and sense of security here in North America. In the United States, we're very slow to learn that we can have such illegitimate actors on the international stage, such as Vladimir Putin. We keep seeing references now back to World War II and the tremendous effort, information effort, factual effort it took in the United States to convince our rather trusting and honest citizens to comprehend the grave threat that Hitler posed not only to Europe's security, but to our own in the United States. We are actually seeing a very similar and parallel response here in the United States regarding Russia's war to Ukraine. In the first 8 years, when Russia invaded in 2014, we were very slow to publicly push the notion that the United States and democracy on the globe is actually being threatened, and that the threat will only grow if we don't respond immediately. We didn't respond hard enough, strong enough, clearly enough, in enough of a united way to stop what happened in 2022, as we all know. The battle for information between 2014 and 2022 in the United States greatly increased as Russia took up what was a full-on information war against democracy and against the unity of the United States. We have seen the results. We have a partisanship in this country that has never before been seen. It is illogical, and it's against our own national security interest and that of all of our democratic allies on the planet, including Ukraine. We are finally getting through to the vast general public. This is critical. We remain a democracy, and as referenced by one of the earlier speakers, one of the most important tools and weapons of protection that we have in the United States is the free, fair, and open media. With the advent of social media, most Americans today have their attention diverted into many different information streams. Few people now watch our major public channels, of which there are many. That is primarily where factual journalism is conveyed, but most spend time on the internet, getting information from people never trained in journalism, fact gathering, or fact checking. This is played upon by Russia. The information space has been heavily influenced by Russia, by its bots, of which you all know even better than we do. But in this atmosphere of Russia's election in its own country, and its illegitimately forced election on temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the problem is exacerbated. The United States always approaches the world with its own perspective on our government. Until recently, we've held our institutions in very high regard. We have trusted them. After all, we are a demos. We are a country of the people, where the government is the people, and when we don't like the government, we simply change and remove them in the very next election, which happens frequently here. Unfortunately, what's happening now is, first, undermining the United States and our own unity, confusing us, diverting our attention to unimportant politicized issues, and keeping us from preserving our own national security. Now, our policymakers and decision makers in Washington know very well that the consequences in Ukraine, fighting against Russia's invasion, they are very fundamental to the preservation of our own security and stability. They also clearly recognize that Ukraine is an equal ally in the global partnership of democracies. To that end, there is still a disjuncture of information between our government officials and the populace writ large. But the populace is the one that votes. So the populace must always be educated, must always be brought along. So the most important weapon and tool that we have against Russia is information based on facts itself. So everything that you do in Ukraine, all the analysis, all the reporting, all the dangerous information gathering is what we need in the West, and particularly in North America, where we just see the world differently. And it makes us very susceptible to dangers that are difficult for most Americans to see. This is what we work on every day here in the United States. Clearly, the elections that Russia is forcibly running in Ukraine over these next 3 days, clearly they are in violation of the Geneva Conventions, of various UN clauses. And today, Ambassador Kyslytsya at the United Nations will be presenting to the United Nations Security Council these violations. This type of activity is crucial and vital, particularly as we see the United States House and Senate have been trying to pass a bill for supplemental security aid to Ukraine since October. And Russia is playing off this. What are they playing off of? They are saying that this is somehow the West losing interest in Ukraine, Western unity breaking apart for Ukraine, Western support for Ukraine's democracy falling apart. None of this is true, but that's what it looks like, and that's how the information propaganda masters can spin our situation, one that they helped create. Dividing us is what Russia does best in the United States. We are trying to inform the populace through all possible means. As a matter of fact, the Republican Party has a large majority that support passing supplemental aid to Ukraine, and all Democrats, but for some withholding their vote because of the tied Israeli aid in the Ukraine package. Some Democrats are currently withholding their vote for that package, but the majority of the House supports passing aid for Ukraine. It is not coming to the House floor for sheer political reasons. Former President Trump, who continues to lead the Republican Party in this country, has told his people not to vote for that aid package. This cannot be interpreted by the world as a strike against support for Ukraine. 95% of it is not. It is a political game being played out in Washington where Ukraine is unfortunately the victim, as is the United States and democracy writ large. Right now, the House has acted to put in a discharge petition. This is a way to circumvent our speaker and get the right to put the Ukraine supplemental aid package, along with aid to Israel and Taiwan, and border security in the United States, this one combined bill, we are trying to get to the floor for a vote. There is no doubt that if and when this goes to the floor for a vote, it will pass. But until that moment, there is a great deal of politicking. Now, we do have suggestions from Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, that he does want the Ukraine aid supplemental to pass, which means he wants it to come to the floor. But he seems to think the time for it to come to the floor will be after the United States passes its own budget, which we have postponed now several times. This is also a fairly new phenomenon in the last 10 to 15 years. What is most important here for the United States to understand is, of course, that these elections are illegitimate and, frankly, have nothing to do with Ukraine. This will not bring representation to Ukraine in a neighboring country which has nothing to do with itself. Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty are not questioned in the United States. There is no overlapping legitimate presence in the eastern parts of Ukraine, where Russia is temporarily occupying territory. There is no question that these are sham elections and that nobody is going to take them to heart as legitimate in Ukraine, nor will they or should they in the United States. However, the space between reality and facts is occupied by the Russian propaganda machine. Disinformation and propaganda are running rampant through U.S. media, funded by, backed by, created by Russia and its friendly allies who amplify the messages on their own social media platforms. That is the greatest danger in the United States. When Americans, from citizen to politicians, when they see clearly and understand what is at stake and what Russia's war on Ukraine is doing to not only Ukraine, but to all democratic countries, then we have appropriate responses, and then we can protect our own security and the security, again, of our Western and democratic allies. The most important thing to realize here, these elections are, of course, a part of the ongoing war against Ukraine by Russia. They're clearly seen as a weapon of Russia against Ukraine, trying to destabilize our Western unity in understanding Ukraine, trying to confuse us, and frankly, they frequently succeed. So we are in an ongoing battle trying to put out factual information. We are extremely grateful to all of those who risk their lives and their own safety just to get us the facts. As a matter of fact, in the state of Michigan alone, within 30 minutes of where I sit at the moment, there are 2 universities who are coding the war crimes based upon evidence collected in Ukraine. The entire country is trying to assist in areas where these types of things are done. Nobody resists. Scholars, academics, those who read the news, those who listen to the news daily, they are all on Ukraine's side. It is just those who can be politically swayed away. Now, we expect Russian tactics against Ukraine to increase greatly after this sham election finishes on Sunday. We expect Putin, of course, to be emboldened. We also expect him to do as he usually does, which is introduce more unsavory actions, such as perhaps a new conscription, gathering up around 400,000 from what we've been hearing, new Russian recruits. He has many ways of doing this domestically and globally, of course, but we are watching carefully and with great anticipation to see what Putin will do next, because he will indeed be emboldened with his next six-year term, almost 60-year term, but 6-year term. And we are watching and listening and appreciative of every effort on your part, and please keep the factual information coming out into the global information space. Дуже вам дякую і слава Україні.
Героям слава, дякую пані Наталі за таке глибоке розуміння і за стільки ідей, які ви сьогодні нам озвучили. Пане Юрію, ви слухали сьогодні фактично людей з різних куточків світу, експертів з міжнародного гуманітарного права. Як ви так само є експертом? Як ви вважаєте, що все ж таки робити Україні і які, можливо, прикладна стратегія найближчим часом буде дуже актуальна?
Дякую за запитання. Зорієнтуйте, скільки в мене часу?
У вас 5 хвилин.
У мене 5 хвилин. Встигну. Дорогі друзі, насправді у форматі сьогоднішньої дискусії ми однозначно не знайдемо відповіді на це запитання, давайте будемо свідомі цього. І як по мені тут ключове зрозуміти дійсно практичні кроки, які ми можемо зробити в незалежності від того, як далі будуть розгортатися події. Я по великому рахунку більше практик, чим теоретик, тому я і буду пропонувати.
I'm more of a practitioner than theorist. This is why I will be talking about different paradigms. So first of all, for the time being, the peoples of Russia, they have no understanding of their future, not at all. They see no their future without Putin, and even in the paradigm of taking their decisions, there is no future, like there is no future where optionally their leader would be absent, and we are the only nation in this globe who could offer another vision of future to the Russian nation, and we are the only nation who is not having the elder brother status, and we never claimed to have this status, so we can help them make their dream come true. So let's recognize that Russian Federation is a classical empire, which it basically is, and based on that, let's renew one of the activities of the 6 bodies of United Nations. No one is impeding us from starting the discussion in this area. Our diplomats have not even started. And the Fostering Council that started its activity in 1996, it continues existing. And further on, nobody impedes us from recognizing the people of Belarusia as the occupied country. We should respond to the activities of Russian Federation asymmetrically, because like all of our direct activities, like let's not humiliate the enemy. They know what they're doing and we have to fight them in a proper way. So talking about those symmetric activities, they will be easily predictable, and to overcome them, Russian Federation will need some more time, and probably within the period we will be able to break their backbone to take up the initiative. So let's be conscious of the fact that politicians in the West listen to their voters, whether we want it or not. So currently we have 12 million active Ukrainians outside Ukraine who can be easily called the big Ukraine sheep, and I want Ukraine as a state to start systemically working with them. I'm not saying all of them are good or bad, or they're all evaded military service or something like that, but they can be the ambassadors that can be used in a number of ways, and thus we may influence the decision-making process in different governments. Look, again, 12 million Ukrainians, and we may lose the majority of them because they can get assimilated there, and they will not look for a future in Ukraine. And to prevent it, we have to start this process now, right here, right now. You know, maybe I'm sounding a little bit naive, given my personal circumstances. My family has not left, and they're still staying in Ukraine. But generally, I hope we should end the practice of double standards. Like one of the Ukrainian politicians was saying, like, well, if we're talking sanctions, let's do sanctions. So the sanctions are either supposed to be effective in the way that they are contemplated, or otherwise they're just unnecessary. So how come every other dollar in Russian Federation is a petrodollar? So they evade the sanctions. So does it mean that we are not capable of exercising proper sanction policy to expand the sanction pressure? Maybe the Western governments, to make their decisions effective or enforce their decisions, should copy the government of Russia somewhere in Poland or in Germany. So probably to ask the inhabitants of those areas along the border, to ask them whether they want to vote for Putin. In the same way, you know, the desires of our citizens are not being taken into account in Crimea and for regions of Ukraine. So out of what I'm saying, what is so impossible to implement? And based on what can be said, there is a number of things that are supposed to be done without mentioning, like one small nuance. For example, today, Miss Alina has shown a number of Western journalists who root so bad for Russian Federation. There are dozens, well, there are hundreds of them, right? But dear colleagues, do they do it for free? Do they do it like based upon their will? Well, I understand. Well, there are sick people. Basically, yes, there are sick people who love Putin. They have a right to exist like a degenerative class, but again, there are Russian propagandists who make a lot of money on that, so let's prove it. It can be a small homework, not only for our special services, but for other countries' special services, those who are involved in solving the problem of Russian Federation. This is what I can say in brief. Thank you very much, Mr. Yuri, for such good wordings. And I'm having a question to you as a politologist. Well, it's important to give a legal assessment of the pseudo-elections in temporarily occupied territories, the legality of elections, legality of Putin's status, the way of development of diplomatic ties, whether the partners would recognize the legitimacy of Putin or not. But Ms. Natalia mentioned that it's important to take into account what's going on in the information space. So are you having this sense, you know, there's a lot of memes about, for example, RNR, Rostov People's Republic, or Kursk People's Republic. So is it safe to say that within the last 10 years we stopped doubting the fact that Putin is a human? He does a lot of terrible things that make his human status contested. So don't you think that in the information space we should stop calling Putin by his last name? Maybe we should call him like Pseudo-Putin. Would media accept this? Well, you know, this information is 80% information warfare. Let me remind you, like last year, there was a history in the box when we were advancing in Kherson area. They started promoting the nuclear strike. topic and stuff like that. So yes, the information is going on in information space, first of all. So in response to your question, you see, in reality, nothing's gonna change objectively, no matter what we call him, no matter how we treat him. And there's only one reason for this. I'm convinced that he does not exist. There is just a number of people who look like somebody who used to be Putin, because a human has something in his heart. They are supposed to have some faith, and they're incapable of committing things like that. I mean, you have to be absolutely like screwed up. I apologize, because being like at your senses, killing people who did nothing wrong to you, killing children. Well, I was witnessing exhumation in Bucha with my own eyes. That's impossible to forget. And again, I apologize. I wish he makes it to this moment when the Hague Court will make its ruling, but I don't believe that he's alive. Calling him pseudo-Putin or just regular Putin, those are the components of our psyops, and we have Alina Bondarchuk sitting right by my side, who is a member of the Center for Countering Misinformation, and it's their job to deal with the narratives imposed by Russia. Well, you've asked the right question, but you're not going to hear any answer from me. You have to hear that answer from those who will be implementing it, from the specialists, from the experts, from the niche experts who can calculate the narratives and the myth that can be accepted by Russian conscience. But I'm sure there should be a discussion going on about this. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Yuri. So we hope that the perpetrators, those who started this war that's going on for years, that they will all be held accountable. And I would like to ask about the ways of condemnation, maybe increase of the sanction pressure by the government of Great Britain, about opportunity of co-leadership of British government and society in terms of condemnation of annexation of Ukrainian territories and its legalization through the pseudo-elections. And I would like to ask Dr. Anicee van Engeland, who is a Dean of the Chair of International Security and Law, International Cranfield University of the United Kingdom. Ms. Anicee?
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate to this distinguished event. And it was very interesting to listen to every single one of you so far. So I will indeed address the British perspective here. So as you know, the United Kingdom has sided with Ukraine very early on, which is not exactly a surprise, as the UK was already very much involved with Ukraine earlier on. And the communication message that has gone through civil society has been very different than the one you would have seen, well, in the United States. We heard an excellent presentation on the topic, but also in France, for example, where I am from. So very quickly, the civil society has been basically mobilized to support Ukraine. And that has translated into many, many ways, which is that the support might have changed today a little bit in terms of how long the conflict is going for. But British people are still very committed, both at the governmental level, at the private companies level, but also at the societal level in terms of supporting Ukraine. I deliver to a lot of private companies, students from private companies like Thales or Babcock, where they're actually extremely proud of their support to Ukraine. Now, what I'm going to look at a little bit more in detail to contribute to discussion is perhaps the UK position on the law. So my esteemed colleagues from Ukraine have put forward a lot of important points in relation to international humanitarian law, in relation to international human rights law, and in relation to war crimes. So just as our colleagues from Estonia and the United States have said the United Kingdom considers this election as a sham. So that's they have no legitimacy, but we still need to worry about the legal consequences, because it's not just a political show that is putting forward, it's also a legal show that he's trying to do. And Anna, just as you were saying, we need to look beyond the "we are concerned" expression to actually what are the stakes, the legal stakes, and how the UK has positioned itself on those stakes. So first of all, the UK has been extremely clear in its position already with the referendum that those were not only shams or illegitimate, but also illegal, that they would not produce any legal output from an international law perspective. As Article 25 of the ICCPR was mentioned earlier, I'll come back to this. Of course, elections are at the heart of democratic governance, and we do not have democratic governance under the rule of Russia. So in terms of co-leadership, this has not just been expressed by, as I said, the British authorities. This is supported by civil society. What's also interesting is to see how the United Kingdom has become a European leader on the matter. Now, of course, we've got the French shift, which is going to be interesting to analyze. As I'm in France actually at the moment, I can tell you there's a little bit of hysteria going on around it. So let's see how in the coming days that translates into concrete action. But the UK has become a motor, and that's really important from a legal perspective, because we are very much in the UK under the impression that Russia is trying to impose a de facto annexation that would turn into a de lege annexation. So those elections will only be the beginning of a legal movement, basically, to extend the greater Russia, the mother Russia, basically bringing back those regions to Mother Russia. So the UK is very concerned, of course, with the violation of sovereignty, has repeated it several times, and considers that those elections will only further the violation of sovereignty, with the possibility perhaps of opening the path to the International Court of Justice, maybe, hoping perhaps that the Venice Commission will actually react with a press release or a report. There are also other elements that the UK is concerned about, which is, well, if we consider that these are occupied territories, at least some of them, I'm not speaking here about Crimea, Donbass, but Donetsk and Luhansk perhaps, if we consider them as occupied territories, then the question that we need to ask is has Russia enough control, effective control, to actually organize election? Do they have the right to organize election? And if we don't react legally, that could actually create a precedent for the future, thinking about other occupied territories in the world. So this is something we need to take into account. The other concern for the UK is from a human rights perspective, and that's been actually mentioned earlier, which is that if we just let this happen without actually protesting, we will undermine the core values of what election actually means for our democracies, with Western Europe and around the world. So respect of separation of power, transparency, respect for the rule of law, the media, NGOs, everything that my esteemed colleagues have already mentioned. The final point, which is something that has been said earlier on by one of the speakers, is of course forcing people to vote. So there is a lot of academic production in the UK on the topic, where British Academy consider that there's also the right not to vote. That would of course be violated then by forcing people to go and vote. And so the question would be, would that open the path for war crimes? Could forcing people to vote will actually be a war crime, which would trigger, of course, an ICC trial. So the United Kingdom is going beyond basically we are shocked. So we speak in English. In the UK, we say a pearl-clutching exercise is when you clutch your pearl and you're like, oh my God, we're actually going beyond this in the UK than expressing our concern. And this is why the UK has been very proactive in supporting the idea of a special tribunal to prosecute later, especially a focus on aggression. So the idea for the British would have this special ad hoc tribunal on aggression that would encompass all forms of crimes, We also have, you were mentioning domestic prosecution. We should not forget, of course, universal jurisdiction. It could be that in the future British courts would actually be keen to prosecute war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine by Russia. So that's something we should not forget. And of course, the power of financial sanctions, which the UK government talks on a regular basis about. So basically, for the British government as it stands right now, we do not believe that there will be legal consequences. The international community does not recognize those elections, so we will not admit any legal consequences as much as the UK would... sorry, I have a migraine today, so I'm a bit confused. As much as Russia would like to create legal sanctions. But we need to be very careful of something, is that the more this war carries on, and that has been stressed by some colleagues here, we need to finish this war quickly, swiftly. The more this war carries on, the more the law is actually going to give powers to Russia. So we've got, for example, a decision from the Israeli Supreme Court that said that when occupation carries on for a very long time, it is possible for the occupier to actually organize election that would be considered as legitimate election. So it is really, really crucial that we keep supporting Ukraine in defeating Russia for not only a positive outcome from an international relation perspective, but also because there are legal concerns that go beyond recording and prosecuting for war crimes, which is changing forever and ever the structure of operation of Ukrainian territories that would have been then fallen into the grasp of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Дуже дякую, пані докторці. Дуже приємно.
Thank you very much. It's important to hear about support like this, and I would like to continue to proceed to talking about the role of European Union. What will be the conclusions drawn there? What will those pseudo-elections mean for the world? And I would like to give the floor for Nikolaus von Twickel from Germany.
Yes.
Yes, we're hearing you clear.
Yes, hello from Berlin, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to see some familiar faces. I would just say that, first of all, I'm not in Brussels. I'm not an EU insider. From what I read and hear, the EU has not taken a strong stance yet in this question regarding the legitimacy of these so-called elections. This looks like they will look for very certain EU member states how they decide, and then try and form a common policy. If the past is any guidance, then the experience of Belarus is, of course, a good example. I don't know whether this has been said before, but basically you probably all know that the EU decided to not recognize the re-election of Mr. Lukashenko, and it actually decided to collectively withdraw its ambassadors from Minsk, which already was a decision that wasn't easy to implement. And as far as I know, there is certainly one country, Hungary, that has not complied and not sent away its ambassador from Minsk. But this is a blueprint, of course, for Russia, because if the EU decides not to recognize the re-election of Mr. Putin, then it would have to do something to prove that it's willing to also take some consequences for this, and not just not recognize on paper, but actually not recognize in action. Withdrawing ambassadors is of course probably not going to be a very easy decision. As far as I know, the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have already done so. in the course of the full-scale invasion, but other countries have not done so, including the United States. And I suppose whenever the issue will come up, some countries might point to the United States and saying, look, not even the United States have withdrawn their ambassador because they believe that it's more important or better for them to keep an ambassador in Moscow and have the possibility to have sort of high-level direct relations with the regime. And so I expect there will be a discussion in Europe, in the EU, and I haven't seen actually a clear-cut, signal from the German government in this respect. I know that Mr. Roth from the SPD has signed the declaration or the petition not to recognize Putin's re-election, but unfortunately Mr. Roth has in the past not been representing the majority of his party and the most powerful people in the SPD. So my opinion is that we'll have to see what happens after Sunday, and then we'll have to hope that somebody in the EU takes the initiative. Maybe it's going to be Mr. Macron. There's a good chance today that Mr. Macron will talk about this with his colleagues from Poland and Germany, with Mr. Scholz and Mr. Tusk. But again, we don't know the outcome of these talks, and I'm going to be very curious. Back to you.
Thank you. And я знаю, що ви
I know that you're trying to keep track of what's going on in Ukraine, in Europe from the Russian point of view, and we're waiting for Europe to stand together and to promote some political narrative. So in your opinion, what are the possible scenarios that will be evolving in European Union, given the Russian opposition presence there, who immigrated to Europe? Thank you.
The Russian opposition needs all the help it can get, but I don't see it yet of being a powerful force in domestic calculations within the EU. Certainly, Yulia Navalny is now a very influential figure, potentially. She has a very strong moral authority. But having said that, I think that decisions such as the non-recognition of Putin's re-election will be taken autonomously of the Russian opposition. And I think that most governments will prefer to make their own judgments according to their, national interests and, of course, according to the collective interests of the EU.
Дякую.
Thank you, Mr. Nikolaus. Thank you for finding time to join us. And we already mentioned it in the beginning of the war 10 years ago, or even in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were a lot of calls from Ukrainians to Russians to arise and step up against Russian aggression, but it resulted in nothing. And now everybody who was able to resist inside of Russia, they all left abroad. So is there still any potential for resistance retaining in Russian Federation? We would like to ask about that Anastasia Sergeeva, who is a Russian dissident, international political expert. Miss Anastasia.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to start from my apologies to the Ukrainians and to all other countries who are touched by my country's aggression. I believe that we have all this responsibility, and my personal one and our collective one, because we can't predict, can't stop this regime, can't stop Putin from doing this, and we have to apologize because of this, and we should do everything we can to change the situation now. Speaking about the situation inside, maybe I would be more about the situation with these so-called elections, pseudo-elections, not only in the occupied territory but in Russia in a whole. And I would like to specify in the very beginning that when I tell Russian Federation, I mean not specifically the country itself, I mean not specifically the state, but I would say it's some kind of criminal state corporation, which is completely different from the normal understanding of state. I will explain it a little bit later. The majority of speakers told about the elections in the occupied territories, which makes this process illegitimate and uneligible to acknowledge as legitimate elections. But I would like to remind that, for example, 6 years ago, in 2018, the last presidential elections, so-called elections as well in Russia, was also conducted in Crimea territory, which was also annexed and occupied by Russian Federation. So, in fact, I believe that current state of Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate president. However, it's not legally or officially recognized by anybody. So we have now, by now, we have a very specific situation with previous elections and current one. The previous speakers told about the specific character of this election, so-called election process, which we have now these days in the occupied territory. I would like to specify that speaking about the whole Russian territory, the situation is very similar. Maybe they have there is no direct threat of some weapon to voters, but in a whole, this time, these pseudo-elections are not more or less post-Soviet, very Soviet. I believe it's very close to first Stalin's elections, which was conducted in 1937 under the great pressure of repressions in the Soviet Union. Now we have the same, not the same, but very similar, very close pattern of the repression, which frightened people, directly frightened people, directly scared the majority of people. And I agree completely, it's difficult to understand and to say whether the majority of Russians would be for Putin or against Putin in some kind of abstract, liberal, free elective situation. But now we can say that anyhow the majority of people are scared of the repressions we have in Russia, and it's about not only about political views about internal situation in the country, but it's about the whole package of legislation concerning the war, concerning the invasion, and concerning the all the international situation, discreditation of army, foreign agents, which are now, foreign agents, for example, now are limited in the election rights, for example. It's much more deep violation than, for example, it was 6 years ago. Law about undesirable organizations, extremism and terrorism legislation, which covers every person who are not agree with the current situation. And of course, the state treason law, which is also very specific now. The point is, for me, for example, is not specifically about the whether we can evaluate this election process or this process as legitimate elections or illegitimate elections. Even more, it's not about specifically whether Putin's next term or Putin's ruling after the 17th of March will be legitimate or not, and will he is a legitimate leader of the country or not. It's even more. It's about the entire legitimacy of the state in the territory of Russia. And I will try to explain this point. First of all, we can say that for many years we didn't have free and fair elections because we didn't have free media, independent court. We didn't have open enough and fair procedures of these elections, and a lot of observation reports, international observation reports told about this at least during the last 12 years or even more. So for us, for example, for Russian dissidents, the question of legitimacy of Putin as a leader of the country, of the president of a country, is very specific and very vulnerable, because I believe the majority of the opposition leaders, not only opposition leaders, but opposition activists, those who are called so-called pro-democracy minority of Russian citizens, very specifically think about the situation with legitimacy of Putin during all these years. However, the majority of time, post-Soviet time, for Russia, election process was some point of procedure which should be more or less acknowledged by international at the international level by different countries, international organizations, and they more or less thought about institute of elections and try to seek some basic principles to make this imitation of elections. Starting from 2014 and then further and further during COVID time, and you remember maybe this voting for constitution changes in 2020, and then after the invasion in 2022, state institutions were more and more eaten by this mafia corporation, which we have as a ruling elite in Russia. And this corporation, in fact, devastating all the procedures of the institutions and institution of election as well. So now we can see not legal procedure, we can see just some symbolic religious procedure of supporting Putin's program, supporting Putin's future. I can't agree that Putin's Russia doesn't have any idea of future. They have the idea of future. I will tell what is it, and we should decide whether we agree with having such a country, with such a territory, with such a vision of future. So, in fact, the currently in Russian Federation we have a very bad situation with state institutions, and in 2022 the final maybe very huge crime was committed by the political elites when they devastated all the legitimacy of the state institutions, and in fact we have now the very formal right to call Russian Federation a failed state. You all remember this campaign with private military companies, Wagner and others, which were involved to the aggression against Ukraine. And I would just like to remind that this process included hiring prisoners to these private military companies, and the process of bringing these prisoners to war was done with the in order to it was like a human trafficking. In fact, it was human trafficking because these people were sent to war voluntarily or violently, but they were sent there without any opportunity, any documents, any legal procedure to escape, to choose some other way. And during the very certain and long period, they were under the full control of the officers, without any rights, without any opportunity to escape from this slavery. In fact, you can see very detailedly it was done very specifically as human trafficking, as international crime, organized by Putin, organized by others. It's also another international crime together with kidnapping of Ukrainian children, together with war crimes they conducted in Ukraine, together with aggression crime they do by invading the Ukraine. And again, moreover, they to make all this hiring prisoners, they used all the legal system of Russian Federation, including police, including court system, justice system, including system of the executive of imprisonment system. So, in fact, all the state was done and was working as hiring the slavers to the war with Ukraine. Just try to understand, just try to realize how it works. And since then, we can't say about the legitimacy of the Russian state at all, about the legitimacy of Russian Federation. It could be done, it could be called only failed state if you look at the basic definition of these words. So by now we can't say about the legitimacy of the elections or legitimacy of Putin as elected president or some other chosen leader of Russia, just because we do not have a state at all in the country. And what we have right now, and speaking about Putin's future, during this campaign, Putin several times told about the principles of future after his re-elections. He specified that war is now a sense of existence of the territory of the society, and they would continue this war until they win, until they establish their criminal order in all territories they want to have. Second point is that they would continue some social care, very specific one. It's like buying people, buying part of the society to escape from some social protests and to keep social loyalty. They would continue repressions and will continue struggling with their enemies, political enemies, and continue keeping political loyalty by this way. And final thing, the most dangerous thing, they plan to form a new ruling class, and they will do it from the SVO heroes, special military operation heroes. They even have this program, Time of Heroes, by now. Which means that people who had their war experience in this war with Ukraine, they can apply to this program and became part of ruling elites at the local level, regional level, leaders of the corporations, directors, managers, officials, and so on. By now, they have more than 40,000 applications. Just think about it, 40,000 applications since February to this special program of Time of Heroes. And they plan to incorporate these people right after 17th of March. During this year, during so-called elections to the regional and local bodies in September, and so on and after. How it would like right now, the social life in this Putin's Russia. You can go to the war at the very beginning, or you can do what you want. You can do any criminal things you want. To kill people, to rob people, to do everything you want. And then you will go to prison, and then you will go to war from prison, because now recruiting from the imprisonments are legally specified as part of law, as part of legal system of Russian Federation. Then you will spend in the front line for half a year. You will have this experience, you will become a very specific criminal person, because we see how the situation in Russian army is now developed. It's not just normal army discipline. It's very specific discipline, the same like it is in prisons in Russia, the same like it is in criminal groups in Russia. It's not about any rights, not about any human rights, it's just about very specific animal pattern of surviving. Also, you can and you should commit criminal crime against humanity. You should commit war crimes during being in the army, during being in the front line. And then after you spend this half a year and survive there, you can come back. You can take the part of this country. You can take the part of the power in this country, and you could have immunity to continue committing any criminal crimes you want, because you will have you will be a part of this criminal band. Big ones, huge ones, you are now a new ruling class.
Дякую, пані.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anastasia.
Yes,
so by now we can see the big territory of Russian Federation, which is not a state, it is failed state, which is not about any rule of law, which is not about any diplomatic communication at all. I believe in this situation we'll not discuss about legitimacy of the elections. We'll not discuss the legitimacy of Putin as legitimate or not legitimate leader of the country. But we should acknowledge the Russian Federation as failed state at the international level, and we should acknowledge that this territory is dangerous for everybody and for its citizens as well. And this territory is a source of international terrorism. And in this situation, we will be able to think about adequate struggle with this criminal mafia. Thank you.
Дякую, пані Анастасія. У нас фактично вже зараз...
Anastasia, our last keynote speaker is Maria Domanska from Republic of Poland, the chief researcher from the Center of Eastern Studies. So what should Russian opposition do to gain power in Russia? What do you think?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Hello, thank you so much for having me here. Before I shift to the opposition topic, I would like to very briefly touch upon two other points. First, I would like to underline that Putin sees the war as the principal source of his domestic legitimacy. And the war is presented by the state propaganda as a natural condition of the nation and the state. What I see is the personality cult of Putin, the cult of violence, and the cult of death on the battlefield. I'm afraid this is a neo-totalitarian social engineering project of creating a new Homo Putinicus, I would say, and it is based on fascism. If we look at the famous list of 14 features of fascism set by Umberto Eco, Russia today meets all the criteria, although to various extents. There is no liberalization would be possible in Russia under Putin, and even after Putin, no liberalization will be possible without an ambiguous Russia's defeat in Ukraine, a deep economic crisis, and a powerful pressure on the Russian new leadership from the West. Unfortunately, what I see is that the West is afraid of a possible destabilization of Russia, although the principal source of this big war in the very center of Europe is precisely Putin's stability. And without a fundamental political change in Russia, Russia will remain an aggressive state, and its foreign policy will remain aggressive vis-à-vis its neighbors and the West as a whole. As regards Putin's legitimacy against the background of this so-called election, I'm pretty sure that the West should not recognize Putin as a legitimate president. Not only because he's a war criminal, not only because he's organizing this election on the occupied territories of Ukraine, not only because mass human rights violations in Russia and political killings, but also because, in fact, for the first time in his political career, Putin is running illegally. He's running based on the constitutional reform of 2020, which was a blatant violation of the constitution in force at that time. So even within the framework of the Russian domestic law, his father's presidency is highly questionable. I'm totally for introducing sanctions against all people involved in organizing this sham election in Ukraine, but I'm also for mass harsh sanctions against all the people involved in human rights violations within Russia. Because the crackdown on the political opposition, the crackdown on the civil society that we saw in the pre-war period, I mean pre-2022, before the full-scale invasion, that was a prerequisite for this escalation of military aggression. Without that crackdown, I would say that the Russian public would have reacted differently to the 24th February. And I understand that this idea of not recognizing Putin causes a lot of reservations, especially among diplomats, among politicians, because that could cause a lot of technical problems, like it would be impossible to appoint ambassadors, for example. But given that Russia has been at war against the West for a longer period now, I think we should think out of the box. We should be creative, and we cannot stick to the standard toolkit of diplomatic and political measures. And in strategic terms, I think that this non-recognition would be a very powerful blow against Putin's image, especially among the ruling elite in Russia, among the nomenclatura. Because what I see is that even though they think that they are convinced that the West is their biggest enemy, even though they despise Western democracies, even though they treat us as losers, they crave Western support, they crave Western respect and legitimacy. And if we recall the arrest warrant against Putin issued by the International Criminal Court, we saw that the Russian propaganda had a huge problem to sell it to the public, and they, in fact, ignored the topic. Russian political opposition and civil society in exile. They don't have many tools to influence directly the political developments in Russia, but I've already mentioned what should be done to contribute to possible political change. But I would like to turn your attention to some positive developments during the last year. First of all, I was very happy to see a year ago that Alexei Navalny at last expressed overtly his attitude on what are the legal borders of the Russian Federation. The legal borders of the Russian Federation are those of 1991. He appealed to pay compensations for Ukraine in the future, and he called for a tribunal to punish the war criminals. Then what Yulia Navalnaya said in the European Parliament, calling the Russian leadership and Putin himself a criminal, I think this was a very good message. I mean, also what we need to do is to change the Western thinking about Putin and the Russian leadership. These are not politicians. These people are criminals and should be treated as criminals and not as politicians. I would add one more thing, that non-recognition of Putin would not do much harm as regards the future negotiations about how the war in Ukraine should end, because Putin has lost all his credibility as a partner for future negotiations. Whatever he promises, he will violate his promises, he will violate any agreement he will sign. So this is just a waste of time to think about any negotiations with him. And the last thing I would like to mention is the anti-war long manifest prepared by the anti-war platform, a network created among the exiled Russians last year. In February, this manifest was published. It's called Manifest for the Sustainable Peace, Manifest za ustойчивый мир. It is a very long document and very carefully prepared. This is 100% right as regards the treatment of what Russia should do vis-à-vis Ukraine, how Russia should change in the future. I think that every Ukrainian could sign it, frankly speaking, because this is very sober look on the whole situation from very rightful position, including the fragment that says about the collective responsibility of the Russian society for the crimes of the regime. Of course, I read it as a collective responsibility in terms of Karl Jasper's understanding of this term. I mean, the responsibility for the type of regime that has formed in Russia over the last more than 2 decades. So I think that these signals from within the exiled Russian communities are extremely important because they really resonate very well together with the messages that come from Ukraine. And in the situation where there is no possibility of official public cooperation between Ukrainian activists and politicians and Russians in exile, I think these parallel messages, like produced at the same time, can really magnify and multiply the power of this narrative. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Дякую, пані Марія. Я хочу подякувати.
Thank you, Maria, and I would like to thank all of the participants for this interesting discussion. Lots of things of practical application that were heard, something that would be of interest to Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, Russian opposition, both inside the Federation and those who left. So this is an ongoing war. Putler united against himself the whole world. Russia has lost this war with Ukraine, but Ukraine still needs to win this war. So stronger together, Ukrinform, thank you for hosting this event. And if the journalists would have any further questions and they would like to contact our international speakers, please request such contacts through us. Thank you for being with us off and online. Thank you and goodbye.